The fastest way to reveal who someone really is, my grandfather used to say, is to give them a chance to judge a stranger. On a chilly Tuesday morning in central Iowa, Marcus Johnson parked his dusty pickup truck outside First Prairie Bank and sat quietly behind the wheel for a moment. The truck had nearly 200,000 miles on it. The paint was faded from years under the Midwest sun, and a thin layer of dry dirt still clung to the wheel wells from the previous week's work. Marcus looked exactly like what he was, a farmer. At 58 years old, he had spent most of his life waking before sunrise, walking fields measured not in acres of ambition but in generations of responsibility. He reached into a worn leather folder resting on the passenger seat and carefully checked its contents one last time. Inside was a check worth $2 million. Most people would have felt nervous carrying that kind of money into a bank. Marcus felt something different. Relief. For nearly 3 years, he had worked through difficult seasons, unpredictable weather, rising equipment costs, and endless negotiations to complete a deal that many people said would never happen. The check represented more than money. It represented promises kept, families supported, employees protected, futures secured. He stepped out of the truck, adjusted his weathered denim jacket, and walked toward the bank's front doors. The lobby was bright, polished, and quiet. Soft music played overhead while customers waited in short lines. A few people glanced at Marcus as he entered. He smiled politely and nodded before making his way toward the service desk. Behind the counter stood Richard Collins, the branch manager. Richard was known throughout the bank for running an efficient operation. He liked order, he liked appearances, and he believed he could tell everything he needed to know about a person within seconds of seeing them. When Marcus approached the counter, Richard's eyes moved from the worn boots to the faded jacket, then briefly to the leather folder tucked beneath his arm. The smile on Richard's face appeared professional, but something colder sat behind it. "Can I help you?" he asked. Marcus returned the smile. "Yes, sir. I'd like to deposit a check." Richard extended his hand. Marcus carefully removed the check and placed it on the counter. For a brief second, Richard looked down casually. Then his eyes widened. $2 million. The number seemed so out of place beside the man standing in front of him that he checked it again. The lobby remained quiet, but something invisible had already shifted. Richard slowly lifted the check, studying it while Marcus stood patiently with both hands resting on the counter. Marcus had no idea that within the next few minutes, this ordinary bank visit would become something nobody inside that building would ever forget. Richard turned the check over and examined every corner as if he expected the paper itself to confess something. Marcus remained calm, standing quietly while other customers continued their business nearby. For several long seconds, Richard said nothing. Then he looked up at Marcus and forced a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "That is a very large check," he said. "Yes, sir," Marcus replied. "It is." Richard glanced at the check again. "Where exactly did you get it?" The question itself was not unusual. The tone was. Marcus noticed it immediately but chose not to react. "From a completed business transaction," he answered. Richard leaned back slightly. "What kind of business transaction?" Marcus kept his voice steady. "The kind that required a lot of years and a lot of work." Richard let out a short laugh. It was quiet, but not quiet enough. A woman standing nearby looked over. Richard tapped the check against the counter. "I am going to need something more specific than that." Marcus nodded politely. "Of course. I sold agricultural property through a legal agreement. Everything is documented." Richard stared at him for a moment. Then his eyes moved once again to the worn jacket, the calloused hands, and the dusty boots. The image in front of him did not match the number printed on the check, and that bothered him. "Agricultural property worth $2 million? He asked. Marcus simply said, "Yes, sir." Richard shook his head slowly. "Interesting." The word carried more doubt than curiosity. A younger teller working nearby glanced toward them. Another employee looked up from her computer. The atmosphere around the service desk began to change. Marcus could feel it. People were listening now. Richard placed the check on the counter and folded his arms. "Do you have an account with this branch?" Marcus answered, "I do." Richard typed into his computer and found the account. His expression shifted for a split second. The account was real. It had existed for years. Even so, the information only deepened his skepticism. He expected a story that fit his assumptions. Instead, every detail seemed to challenge them. "Well," Richard said slowly, "this is not exactly the kind of transaction we see every day." Marcus smiled. "It is not the kind of day I see every day either." A few customers chuckled softly. Richard did not. He felt the conversation slipping away from his control. He picked up the check again and examined the signature. Then he looked directly at Marcus. "You understand that checks can be counterfeit?" Marcus nodded. "Of course. And you understand that banks take fraud very seriously?" "Absolutely." Richard narrowed his eyes. He seemed almost disappointed by how cooperative Marcus remained. There was no argument, no frustration, no defensiveness, just calm confidence. The branch manager had dealt with difficult customers before. He knew how to handle anger. He knew how to handle complaints. What unsettled him was a customer who appeared completely certain of himself without feeling the need to prove anything. And as more eyes around the lobby turned toward the service desk, Richard made a decision that would soon change the course of everyone's day. Richard cleared his throat and straightened his tie. The quiet curiosity spreading through the lobby seemed to encourage him rather than discourage him. He wanted control of the situation, and he wanted everyone nearby to know he was the one making the decisions. He placed the check flat on the counter and spoke a little louder than necessary. "Mr. Johnson, before we go any further, I need to verify a few things." Marcus nodded. "Take all the time you need." Richard tapped the paper with one finger. "A check for $2 million usually comes with a very different story than the one I am seeing today." Several customers looked over. Marcus understood exactly what Richard meant. He was not talking about paperwork. He was talking about appearances. Still, Marcus kept his expression calm. "Sometimes appearances do not tell the whole story," he replied. Richard smiled thinly. "That is certainly one way to look at it." He turned to his computer and typed for nearly a minute. The longer he searched, the more frustrated he became. Nothing he found supported his suspicion, yet he continued searching as if he simply had not discovered the problem yet. Finally, he looked up. "Do you have identification?" Marcus handed over his driver license. Richard examined it carefully. Then he examined it again. Then he compared it to the account information. Everything matched. Marcus stood patiently while the customers nearby watched the exchange unfold. An older gentleman waiting in line shifted uncomfortably. A young woman seated near the entrance lowered her phone and paid closer attention. The atmosphere felt less like a bank and more like a courtroom where everyone was silently waiting for a verdict. Richard returned the license. "How long have you been farming?" Marcus answered honestly. "Most of my life." "And farming brought you a $2 million check?" Richard asked. Marcus smiled politely. "Years of work brought me that check." A few people nearby exchanged glances. The answer was simple, but it carried a quiet confidence that Richard found irritating. He was accustomed to being the most authoritative voice in the room. Marcus was not challenging him, yet somehow he was refusing to be diminished by him. Richard folded his arms again. "You understand why this raises questions." "I understand why a bank verifies transactions," Marcus said. "What I do not understand is why my transaction seems to be the only one drawing an audience." The comment landed softly, but several customers immediately looked away. Richard felt his face tighten. Marcus had not accused him of anything. He had merely pointed out what everyone could already see. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Richard reached for the check again and held it up toward the lobby lights. He studied the paper as though it contained some hidden flaw nobody else could detect. "Interesting," he said once more. "Very interesting." Marcus remained silent. He had learned long ago that some people reveal more about themselves when given enough room to talk. Richard set the check back down and made another decision. Instead of quietly processing the verification through standard procedures, He was about to turn a routine transaction into something much larger. And as he reached for the phone on his desk, several people in the lobby instinctively leaned closer, sensing that the situation was about to take an unexpected turn. Richard lifted the phone and pressed a button that connected him to the bank's internal operations desk. His voice carried across the lobby with deliberate clarity. "I need additional verification on a large check," he said. "A very large check." The emphasis was impossible to miss. Several customers exchanged glances. Marcus remained standing calmly at the counter, his hands folded in front of him. He had spent decades dealing with droughts, floods, equipment failures, and market swings. Patience was not something he practiced. It was something he lived. Richard listened for a moment, then began repeating details from the check. Every few seconds he looked up at Marcus as though expecting signs of nervousness. He found none. That only seemed to make him more determined. After ending the call, Richard placed the receiver down and sighed dramatically. "This may take a while," he announced. "Large transactions often require extensive review." Marcus nodded. "I understand." Richard tilted his head. "You do not seem concerned." "Should I be?" Marcus asked. A faint laugh escaped from someone waiting near the loan office. Richard ignored it. Most people would be anxious under these circumstances. Marcus smiled politely. Most people know whether they are holding a legitimate check before they walk into a bank. The answer drew another round of quiet reactions from nearby customers. Richard felt the room slipping away from him again. He had expected uncertainty. Instead, Marcus answered every question with calm confidence. The branch manager turned back to his computer and opened additional records. As he searched, he noticed something unusual. The company listed on the check was real. The transaction appeared real. The signatures matched known records. Each piece of information removed another reason for suspicion. Yet rather than easing his doubts, it seemed to increase his frustration. The facts refused to support the conclusion he had already formed. A teller named Emily approached carefully. "Mr. Collins," she said quietly. "Operations sent a preliminary note." Richard took the message and scanned it. His jaw tightened slightly. The note did not raise concerns. If anything, it suggested the transaction appeared legitimate pending routine confirmation. Emily waited for instructions. Richard folded the paper and slipped it beside his keyboard. "Thank you," he said. She hesitated before returning to her station. Marcus noticed everything but said nothing. Across the lobby, people had begun paying less attention to their own business and more attention to the unusual standoff at the service desk. The tension no longer came from uncertainty about the check. It came from uncertainty about why the situation was continuing at all. Richard finally leaned forward. "Mr. Johnson, perhaps you should explain exactly why someone issued a check this size in your name." Marcus met his gaze. "Because after years of negotiations, a sale was completed successfully." "That is all?" Richard asked. "That is the truth," Marcus replied. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Marcus glanced at the large clock mounted on the wall above the teller stations. The gesture was brief and casual, but it caught Richard's attention. "Do you have somewhere else to be?" Richard asked. Marcus smiled. "Not particularly, but there are people waiting on the outcome of this transaction." "People?" Richard asked. "Families," Marcus answered. "Employees. Folks counting on promises being kept." The simplicity of the statement settled over the room. For the first time, a few customers began looking at Marcus differently. Not as a stranger holding an unusually large check, but as a man carrying responsibility. And while Richard was still searching for reasons to doubt him, events already set in motion beyond the walls of the branch were moving steadily toward the bank. Richard glanced at the clock and then back at Marcus. Nearly 20 minutes had passed, yet the farmer's calm demeanor had not changed. That composure bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Most people faced with this level of scrutiny would have become frustrated, defensive, or eager to prove themselves. Marcus did none of those things. He simply waited. The branch manager tapped his fingers against the counter before reaching for the check once again. You said families are depending on this money, Richard said. That is right, Marcus replied. How many families? Enough that I would rather not keep them waiting longer than necessary. Richard leaned back in his chair. That sounds important. Marcus nodded. It is. The answer was simple, but it carried weight. A customer seated near the windows lowered his newspaper and listened more carefully. Another customer quietly postponed her own transaction so she could watch what happened next. Without realizing it, the entire lobby had begun measuring the two men. One carried authority because of his title. The other carried authority because of his character. Richard opened another file on his computer and searched for additional details connected to the transaction. Again, the information refused to support his doubts. The company behind the payment was legitimate. The documentation appeared complete. The account history revealed years of responsible banking activity. Every fact seemed to point in the same direction. Yet Richard remained determined to find something that justified his suspicion. This is unusual, he said. A farmer receiving this kind of payment is not something we see every day. Marcus smiled politely. Most people do not see what happens before the harvest either. The comment caused a few people nearby to exchange knowing looks. An older woman waiting in line nodded quietly to herself. Richard felt the conversation slipping away from him once more. He wanted Marcus to explain himself. Instead, Marcus kept offering small truths that somehow made the branch manager look increasingly unreasonable. Emily returned to the desk carrying another printed message from operations. Mr. Collins, she said carefully. They responded again. Richard took the paper and read it. His expression hardened immediately. Emily noticed. Is everything okay? She asked. I will handle it, Richard answered. She returned to her station, but not before catching a glimpse of the document. The note was brief. According to preliminary verification, the transaction appeared authentic and routine. Richard folded the paper and placed it face down. Marcus noticed the movement. So did several customers. Good news? Marcus asked calmly. Richard hesitated. Nothing has been finalized. Of course, Marcus replied. Then he looked at the clock again. This time his expression remained unchanged, but something about the gesture felt different. It was almost as if he knew a timetable nobody else knew. Outside, beyond the large front windows of the bank, a dark luxury sedan turned into the parking lot. Most people inside never noticed it. Marcus did. His eyes briefly moved toward the entrance before returning to the counter. Richard continued searching for reasons to delay the transaction, completely unaware that the next person to walk through those doors was about to change the entire direction of the day. The luxury sedan came to a smooth stop outside the bank, but inside the lobby nobody paid much attention. Customers remained focused on the unusual scene unfolding at the service desk. Richard, meanwhile, seemed determined to stretch the process even further. He opened another screen on his computer and slowly reviewed information he had already reviewed twice. These things take time, he said, almost as if he were reminding the room rather than Marcus. I appreciate careful work, Marcus replied. Good decisions usually come from it. The answer sounded respectful, yet somehow it made Richard feel even less comfortable. He could not understand why the farmer standing in front of him seemed completely untroubled. Every delay had failed to produce frustration. Every question had failed to create doubt. Marcus simply stood there with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where he stood. The front doors opened. A cool breeze drifted into the lobby. Several customers glanced toward the entrance before returning their attention to the counter. A tall man in an expensive navy suit stepped inside. His silver hair was neatly trimmed, and his presence immediately drew subtle reactions from a few employees who recognized him. Emily looked up from her station and froze for a moment. Another teller straightened in her chair. Richard did not notice. His attention remained fixed on Marcus. Tell me something, Richard said. If this transaction is so important, why not schedule it through a private banking office? Marcus smiled slightly. Because sometimes the simplest door is still the right door. Richard shook his head. Most people handling this kind of money do not walk in wearing work boots. Marcus glanced down briefly. These boots helped earn it. A quiet silence settled across the lobby. Even customers who had never met Marcus found themselves respecting the answer. There was no arrogance in it, only truth. Meanwhile, the man in the navy suit continued walking through the bank. He exchanged greetings with several employees as he passed. Each greeting carried a level of familiarity that suggested he was more than an ordinary visitor. Emily's eyes moved nervously between him and Richard. She appeared to be debating whether she should interrupt. Before she could decide, Richard spoke again. "I still find this entire situation highly unusual." Marcus nodded. "That much has been clear." Richard leaned forward. "You do not seem bothered by any of this." "Should I be?" Marcus asked calmly. Richard opened his mouth, then paused. For the first time all morning, he did not have an immediate answer. The man in the navy suit was now only a few steps away. Several employees were watching him closely. One even stood as he approached. Yet Richard remained unaware. He was too focused on proving something that the evidence refused to support. Marcus, however, noticed the approaching figure immediately. His expression did not change. He simply looked toward the man for a brief moment and then returned his attention to the counter. The gesture was small, almost invisible, but it carried the quiet certainty of someone who knew exactly who had just walked into the building and exactly what was about to happen next. The man in the navy suit slowed his pace as he approached the service area. Several employees greeted him with nervous smiles, but he acknowledged them only briefly. His attention appeared to be focused on something else. Richard finally noticed the unusual reactions around the lobby and turned slightly in his chair. The moment he recognized the visitor, his posture changed. "Mr. Carter," he said quickly, standing to his feet. William Carter, regional president of the bank, nodded politely. "Good morning, Richard." The branch manager immediately forced a confident smile. "What a surprise. We were not expecting you today." William glanced around the lobby. The best visits usually happen when nobody is expecting them. A few employees exchanged uneasy looks. Richard laughed softly, hoping to ease the tension. "Everything is running smoothly." William's eyes moved across the room. He noticed the customers who seemed unusually interested in the service desk. He noticed Emily standing rigidly at her station. Most importantly, he noticed Marcus. For the briefest moment, something flashed across William's face. Recognition, not confusion, not curiosity. Recognition. Marcus simply nodded once. William returned the nod with equal calm. Richard failed to notice the exchange. "We are just handling a transaction review," he explained. "A precautionary matter." William looked at the check resting on the counter. "A precautionary matter?" Richard immediately began explaining. "Large amount. Unusual circumstances. We are verifying everything thoroughly." William listened without interruption. Marcus remained silent. The customers remained silent. The entire lobby seemed to be holding its breath. Richard continued talking. The more he spoke, the more confident he became. "You know how important it is to protect the bank. Sometimes people present documents that require extra scrutiny." William glanced at Marcus again. "I see." Richard mistook the response for agreement. "Exactly. I would rather be overly careful than careless." William slowly nodded. "Normally that is a wise approach." The compliment encouraged Richard. "That is what I was thinking." William stepped closer to the counter. His eyes settled on the check for several seconds. Then he looked at Marcus. A faint smile appeared. It was not the smile of a banker examining paperwork. It was the smile of someone greeting a familiar and respected individual. Marcus returned the smile. Nothing more. No explanation. No introduction. Yet the simple exchange caused Emily's eyes to widen. She suddenly understood that something important was unfolding. Richard still did not. He remained convinced that the situation was under control. "We are waiting on final confirmation," he said. "Until then, I believe caution is appropriate." William looked at him carefully. And how long has Mr. Johnson been standing here? Richard glanced at the clock. Perhaps 30 minutes. The regional president's expression hardened slightly. 30 minutes? We wanted to be thorough, Richard replied. William said nothing for a moment. The silence felt heavier than any criticism. Several customers looked between the two men. Marcus remained completely relaxed. In fact, he appeared less concerned than anyone else in the building. Then William took one final step toward the counter, his eyes still fixed on Marcus. And in that instant Richard felt the first small crack appear in the certainty he had carried all morning. William rested one hand lightly on the counter and looked directly at Marcus. For a moment neither man spoke. The silence stretched across the lobby and seemed to pull everyone's attention toward them. Richard shifted uncomfortably. He had expected William to focus on procedures, documentation, or risk management. Instead, the regional president appeared far more interested in the man standing quietly beside the counter. "How have you been?" William asked. Marcus smiled. "Doing well. Busy as always." "That sounds about right," William replied. A few employees exchanged confused looks. This was not the conversation they expected. Richard forced a laugh. "You two know each other?" William glanced toward him. "Yes, we do." The simplicity of the answer somehow made the room even quieter. Richard immediately tried to recover. "Well, that certainly explains part of the situation." William raised an eyebrow. "Which part?" The question caught Richard off guard. "The familiarity," he said. "I was simply making sure proper procedures were followed." William nodded slowly but did not respond. Instead, he turned back toward Marcus. "I heard congratulations are in order." Marcus gave a modest shrug. "The deal finally closed." "After all these years," William said. "After all these years," Marcus agreed. The customers listening nearby had no idea what deal they were discussing, but they could hear the respect in William's voice. It was not the respect given to a wealthy client. It was the respect given to someone whose reputation had already been earned. Richard felt the atmosphere changing around him. The confidence he had displayed throughout the morning was beginning to fade. "We are still completing verification," he said. "Naturally." William looked at the check again. "And what concerns have you uncovered?" Richard opened his mouth, then hesitated. The question sounded simple, but suddenly it felt dangerous. "We are being thorough," he answered. "That is not what I asked." William's tone remained calm. There was no anger in it. Somehow that made it harder to answer. "Nothing has been finalized," Richard repeated. William waited. The branch manager searched for a response that sounded reasonable. "Given the amount involved, I felt additional review was appropriate." "Did operations identify a problem?" William asked. Richard hesitated again. "Not exactly." "Did account records identify a problem?" "No." "Did identification records identify a problem?" "No." Several customers exchanged glances. Emily lowered her eyes toward her workstation. Richard suddenly became aware that every answer was pushing him into a smaller corner. William remained composed. "Then help me understand what concern remains." For the first time all morning, Richard had no immediate reply. He looked at Marcus, then at the check, then back at William. The answer sitting in his mind was one he could never say aloud, because the concern had never truly come from the paperwork. It had come from an assumption. And now, standing in front of employees, customers, and a regional president who clearly knew Marcus well, that assumption was beginning to unravel piece by piece. Marcus remained silent through all of it. He did not defend himself. He did not accuse anyone. He simply stood there with the patience of a man who had already learned one of life's hardest lessons. Eventually people reveal themselves, and when they do, the truth rarely needs any help. Richard could feel the attention of the entire lobby settling on him. Only an hour earlier he had been completely certain of the situation. Now every question from William seemed to expose a gap between what he believed and what he could actually prove. The regional president remained calm. He was not raising his voice. He was not making accusations. He was simply asking for facts. and facts were becoming increasingly difficult for Richard to use in support of his position. William turned toward Marcus once more. "I heard the final negotiations took longer than expected." Marcus nodded. "A lot longer. But you stayed with it. The people depending on it deserved that." William smiled. "That sounds like you." The exchange seemed ordinary, yet it carried years of familiarity. Customers who had been watching quietly began to realize that Marcus was not simply someone William recognized. There was genuine respect between them. Richard noticed it too. The realization made him increasingly uneasy. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion privately," he suggested. William looked at him. "Why?" Richard hesitated. "For confidentiality." William glanced around the room. "You were comfortable discussing concerns publicly a few minutes ago." The statement landed softly but carried unmistakable weight. Richard felt heat rise in his face. Across the lobby, Emily lowered her eyes again. Several customers shifted awkwardly. Nobody said a word. Marcus remained completely composed. He seemed more interested in resolving the transaction than in the uncomfortable atmosphere surrounding it. William picked up the check and examined it himself. Unlike Richard, he spent only a few seconds looking at it. Then he placed it back on the counter. "This appears straightforward." Richard immediately responded. "Large transactions deserve caution." "Agreed," William said. "But caution and suspicion are not the same thing." The words settled heavily over the room. Richard opened his mouth, then stopped. For the first time all morning, nobody came to his rescue. The paperwork was legitimate. The account was legitimate. The identification was legitimate. The transaction history was legitimate. One by one, every possible concern had disappeared. Yet the delay had continued. William folded his hands. "Tell me something, Marcus. What happens after this clears?" Marcus smiled. "The first thing? Payroll." Several customers looked surprised. William nodded knowingly. "Still taking care of everybody first." "That was always the plan," Marcus replied. "How many people are we talking about now?" "Just over 80 families directly. More if you count suppliers and contractors." A few quiet gasps could be heard nearby. Until that moment, most people had viewed Marcus as a customer standing at a bank counter. Now they were beginning to understand the scale of responsibility he carried. Richard stared at him. 80 families. The number challenged every assumption he had made. Marcus did not look powerful. He did not speak like someone trying to impress anyone. Yet everything William said suggested he was far more influential than anyone in the room had realized. Then William looked directly at Richard and asked a question that seemed simple on the surface. "Before I arrived, did Mr. Johnson give you any reason to doubt his honesty?" Richard searched for an answer. He searched longer than anyone expected. And in the silence that followed, the entire lobby began to understand what his answer really was. Richard searched for an answer, but every response that came to mind sounded worse than the silence. The lobby remained completely still. Even customers who had been waiting for routine transactions seemed unwilling to leave. William watched him patiently. There was no hostility in his expression. He was simply waiting for the truth. Finally, Richard cleared his throat. "No," he admitted. "Mr. Johnson has been cooperative." William nodded. "Has he provided valid identification?" "Yes." "Has the account information matched?" "Yes." "Has operations identified any irregularities?" "No." Each answer seemed to remove another layer of certainty from the branch manager's position. William folded his hands and glanced briefly at Marcus. "Then it sounds like the transaction has been handled by the book." Richard hesitated. "Not completely." William raised an eyebrow. "What part remains?" Richard looked toward the check. "Final confirmation." Before William could respond, Emily carefully approached the counter holding a freshly printed document. Her nervous expression suggested she already knew the importance of what was written on the page. "Mr. Collins," she said softly, "Operations just sent the final report." The room seemed to grow even quieter. Richard took the paper and read it. His eyes moved across the page once. Then again. The color drained from his face. William waited. Marcus remained calm. After several long seconds, William asked, "What does it say?" Richard swallowed. "The transaction is verified." Nobody spoke. Richard continued reading. "The check is authentic." The silence deepened. "The funds have been confirmed." A customer near the entrance slowly shook his head in disbelief. Another customer looked toward Marcus with newfound respect. The entire situation that had consumed the bank for nearly an hour had just been resolved by a few simple sentences. William nodded. "Thank you." Then he looked directly at Marcus. His expression softened noticeably. "I apologize for the delay, sir." The word landed like a thunderclap. "Sir." Not as a formality. Not as customer service. As genuine respect. Several employees immediately looked at one another. Richard froze. Customers who had been quietly observing suddenly understood that they had witnessed something much larger than a banking transaction. Marcus smiled politely. "I appreciate that." William continued. "You have always been patient, but you should not have been kept waiting this long." Richard stared at Marcus. The title echoed in his mind. "Sir." Throughout the morning he had viewed the farmer as someone who needed to prove himself. Yet the most senior person in the building had addressed him with unmistakable admiration. William turned toward the customers gathered nearby. "Many people know Mr. Johnson as a successful agricultural businessman. What fewer people know is that he has spent years creating jobs across multiple counties, supporting local families, funding scholarships, and helping small communities survive difficult economic times." The room fell completely silent. Marcus looked slightly uncomfortable with the attention. William noticed and smiled. "I know you do not enjoy talking about those things." Marcus chuckled softly. "Not much point in talking about them." "That is exactly why they matter," William replied. And in that moment, the image many people had formed when Marcus first walked through the bank's doors began to disappear, replaced by a far more accurate picture of the man who had been standing quietly in front of them all along. The atmosphere inside the bank had completely changed. An hour earlier, people had been looking at Marcus with curiosity. Now they were looking at him with respect. Yet the man at the center of the attention seemed entirely unchanged. He stood exactly as he had before, calm, patient, and focused on the reason he had come to the bank in the first place. William turned toward the employees gathered nearby. "Many of you probably do not know this," he said, "but several years ago, when a manufacturing plant closed in this region, hundreds of families were worried about how they would make ends meet. While everyone else was discussing the problem, Marcus was already creating solutions." The customers listened carefully. Even Richard remained silent. "He invested in agricultural development projects that created jobs," William continued. "He partnered with local businesses. He helped keep people working when opportunities were disappearing." Marcus shook his head slightly. "A lot of people contributed." William smiled. "That sounds exactly like something you would say." A few customers laughed softly. The tension that had dominated the lobby for so long was beginning to dissolve. Richard stared at the counter. Every new detail seemed to make his earlier assumptions appear smaller and smaller. He had spent nearly an hour questioning Marcus because the image in front of him did not match the story he expected. Now he was discovering that the story had always been there. He simply never bothered to look beyond the surface. William turned back toward Marcus. "How many acres did the final agreement involve?" Marcus answered modestly. "Just under 8,000. Several people visibly reacted. The number sounded enormous. An older customer near the waiting area quietly whispered, 8,000 acres? Marcus heard him and smiled. Spread across several properties. William nodded. Which explains the size of the transaction. Richard looked up slowly. The check that had seemed impossible now appeared completely logical. Every piece fit together perfectly. The problem had never been the transaction. The problem had been perception. Emily stepped closer to the counter. "Mr. Johnson," she said gently, "would you like us to begin processing the deposit immediately?" Marcus smiled warmly. That would be wonderful. Emily nodded and began preparing the paperwork. Unlike earlier, her movements carried confidence rather than uncertainty. William watched the process for a moment before speaking again. You mentioned payroll comes first. Marcus nodded. Always. Even after all these years? William asked. Especially after all these years, Marcus replied. People trust you with their livelihoods. That responsibility never gets smaller. The answer resonated throughout the lobby. It was not the response of someone obsessed with money. It was the response of someone who understood leadership. Several customers who had entered the bank as strangers now found themselves quietly admiring the farmer standing at the counter. Richard noticed their reactions. He noticed the respect in William's voice. He noticed the ease with which Marcus carried himself despite everything that had happened. And for the first time that morning, he began to understand that true success rarely announces itself. Often it arrives wearing ordinary clothes, speaking quietly, and expecting nothing more than basic respect. The realization settled heavily in his mind as the final paperwork moved forward and the consequences of his own choices became impossible to ignore. Emily continued processing the deposit while the rest of the lobby slowly returned to life. Customers resumed conversations, tellers returned to their stations, and the ordinary rhythm of the bank began to reappear. Yet beneath the surface something had changed. People had witnessed a lesson unfold in real time, and none of them would leave quite the same way they had entered. Richard remained standing near the counter. For the first time all morning, he seemed uncertain about where to look. His confidence had been built on assumptions that no longer existed. Every fact had pointed in one direction, while he had insisted on looking in another. William observed him quietly. There was no satisfaction in his expression. No sense of victory, only disappointment. After a long silence, Richard finally spoke. "Mr. Johnson," he said. Marcus turned toward him. "Yes." Richard paused. Finding the right words appeared difficult. "I owe you an apology." The lobby became quiet again. Marcus listened without interruption. "I should have handled this differently," Richard continued. "The verification process was appropriate. The way I approached it was not." Several employees lowered their eyes. The statement was honest, and everyone knew how difficult it was for someone in a position of authority to admit a mistake publicly. Marcus studied him for a moment. "I appreciate you saying that." Richard nodded slowly. "You were patient when you had every reason not to be." Marcus smiled slightly. "Patience usually costs less than anger." A few customers chuckled softly. Even William smiled. The response carried no bitterness, no attempt to embarrass anyone. It was simply another small piece of wisdom from someone who had spent a lifetime solving harder problems than hurt feelings. Richard looked down briefly. "I made assumptions." Marcus nodded. "We all do." "Not like this," Richard replied quietly. The honesty surprised even him. Marcus considered the statement before answering. "The important part is what happens after you realize it." The words hung in the air. William folded his arms and listened. Marcus continued. "Everybody gets judged at some point. The question is whether we learn from it when it happens." Richard slowly nodded. For the first time, he seemed less concerned with defending himself and more interested in understanding the lesson. Across the room, several customers listened carefully. The conversation had become bigger than either man. It was no longer about a check, a transaction, or even a misunderstanding. It was about the habits people carry into every interaction. William finally spoke. "That is one reason I have always respected Marcus." He glanced around the lobby. Success never changed the way he treated people. Marcus shook his head modestly. "Success changes some people because they think it proves their value. It does not." William smiled. "Then what does?" Marcus looked around the room. His answer came without hesitation. "How you treat people when you think they cannot do anything for you." The lobby fell silent once more. No speech could have been more powerful. No lecture could have been more direct. The customers understood it. The employees understood it. And Richard understood it most of all. As the final deposit paperwork neared completion, the transaction itself seemed almost insignificant compared to the lesson that had emerged from it. Money had started the morning's events, but character was what everyone would remember. The final documents were completed a few minutes later. Emily handed the confirmation paperwork across the counter with a smile that carried both professionalism and genuine respect. Marcus reviewed the forms briefly and signed where needed. The process that should have taken only a short time had consumed most of the morning, yet there was no frustration on his face. He thanked Emily, gathered his folder, and prepared to leave. Before he could step away, William extended his hand. "I am glad everything was finally resolved." Marcus shook it warmly. "I am glad too." William smiled. "And I am sorry for how long it took." Marcus nodded. "The delay is over. That is what matters." The answer reflected the same attitude he had shown from the moment he entered the bank. He was interested in solutions, not grudges. Several customers watched quietly as the two men spoke. They had expected a dramatic confrontation. Instead, they were witnessing something far more powerful: dignity. William looked toward Richard. The branch manager remained silent. He appeared thoughtful now, as if replaying the entire morning in his mind. Marcus noticed. He walked over and stopped beside him. Richard looked up, uncertain what to expect. "I meant what I said," he told Marcus. "I am sorry." Marcus nodded. "I know." Richard hesitated before asking, "How did you stay so calm?" A faint smile crossed Marcus's face. "Because I learned a long time ago that other people's assumptions do not define me." The answer settled heavily over the room. Richard looked away for a moment. He understood the lesson better now than he had an hour earlier. Marcus continued, "If you spend your life trying to prove your worth to every person who doubts you, you never have time to do the work that actually matters." Nobody spoke. The statement carried the weight of experience. It was not something Marcus had read in a book. It was something he had lived. William nodded in agreement. "That is why people trust him." Marcus laughed softly. "People trust me because I try to keep my word." "Exactly," William replied. The customers nearby smiled. Some shook their heads in admiration. Others simply stood quietly, reflecting on what they had witnessed. Marcus thanked the staff one final time and turned toward the entrance. As he walked across the lobby, people who had never met him began offering small nods of respect. He returned each one. There was no triumph in his expression, no desire to make anyone feel small, just the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly who he was. Outside, sunlight reflected across the parking lot as Marcus stepped toward his old pickup truck. It looked exactly the same as it had when he arrived. The truck had not changed. His clothes had not changed. His boots had not changed. The only thing that had changed was how people saw him. And perhaps that was the real lesson. Character is not created by money. Dignity is not created by titles. Respect should never depend on appearances. The value of a person cannot be measured by the clothes they wear, the vehicle they drive, or the assumptions others choose to make. It is measured by integrity, responsibility, and the way they treat people when nobody is watching. As Marcus started the engine and drove away, 80 families were one step closer to receiving the support they depended on. The bank returned to its normal routine. The customers eventually went home. But everyone who had witnessed that morning carried the same reminder with them. The easiest person to underestimate is often the person who no longer needs anyone's approval.